I'm Adrian Vance, 37 years old. My life now is in Portland, a city where the persistent rain and glowing skyline feel like a cover for countless untold heartbreaks. I've built a successful real estate firm from the ground up, a deliberate act of forging a new life far from a past defined by agony. To understand the man I am now, you have to journey back with me to Bedford, Ohio. That's the town that raised me and the source of memories, some beautiful, some deeply wounding, that visit me in my sleep even to this day. Back in the 1980s, Bedford was the kind of small town where life moved slowly under canopies of old trees lining streets of charming clapboard homes. We lived in a sprawling historic house, and I swear the very plaster of its walls held the echo of my mother Clara's joy and affection. She was the sun in my small universe, a woman whose smile could soothe any scrape and whose arms were my constant refuge. It was Clara who showed me the magic of turning a simple piece of paper into a crane, who taught me to find stories in the colors of a setting sun, and who instilled in me the belief that even in a world capable of great cruelty, there was always something beautiful to be found. I can still conjure the scent of warm cookies filling our kitchen on those long afternoons. Her voice a soft melody as she wove fantastic stories or hummed lullabies that remain etched in my memory. My father, Robert Vance, was the founder of Vance Holdings, a thriving real estate company that demanded nearly all of his time. His work kept him on the road constantly, making his returns feel like major events. He would arrive with a small token, a miniature car, a new book with bright illustrations. But the real gift was his hug. Being wrapped in his arms was a powerful grounding embrace that for a fleeting moment made me feel like the most important person on earth. Then, when I was only 8, that entire world of light and warmth was abruptly snuffed out. The diagnosis was a thunderclap that shattered our world. Breast cancer. The disease was a thief, and it stole my mother from us piece by piece over the course of a single brutal year. The memory of her in that sterile hospital room is burned into my mind, the scent of antiseptic forever linked with the worst day of my life. I can still see how the light had begun to fade from her eyes, yet she summoned the strength to give me a weak, trembling smile. "Adrian, you have to be strong, you hear me? I will always be with you right here in your heart." I just nodded, my throat too tight to form a single word. Those were her final words to me. And then, just like that, she was gone. She closed her eyes, and the vibrant life that was Clara simply ceased to be. I only remember fragments of my mother's funeral, as if I was watching a movie of someone else's life while my own mind floated somewhere far away. The sound that cut through the fog was the relentless drumming of rain on a sea of black umbrellas, a mournful, percussive rhythm. A hollow ache opened up inside my chest, a void so vast it felt like the entire world had caved in on itself. For a moment, my father, a man I'd always seen as invincible, crushed me against him in a desperate hug. I clung to him, not realizing it was the last time I would ever feel that kind of warmth from him. After we buried Clara, my father seemed to bury himself. He retreated into his work, using Vance Holdings as a fortress against his grief, and in doing so, he left me behind. The mansion that had once felt so full of life became a cavernous, silent place, its walls holding only cold echoes. I learned to move through the rooms like a ghost, a silent observer in my own home. My only comfort came from her things, the soft wool scarf she'd knitted, the leather-bound diary filled with her elegant script, the flock of paper cranes we'd made together. They were all that was left of her. 2 years passed like that, in a quiet gray haze. Then, when I was 10, my father brought a woman named Diana into our lives. Diana was tall and severe, with hair the color of ice and a gaze that seemed to cut right through you. She swept into our house not like a guest, but like a conqueror, with her 2 children, Olivia and Leo, trailing behind her like soldiers. My father, with an awkwardness I'd never seen in him, introduced her as my new mother. The words felt like a betrayal. A cold certainty settled in my gut. This woman would never, ever take Clara's place. Her presence instantly poisoned the air, replacing the lingering scent of my mother's memory with something cold and artificial. The gloom that had settled over the house after my mother died deepened into something suffocating with Diana's arrival. It felt like the air itself grew heavier, colder. She immediately began to assert her control over every corner of our home, an invasion cloaked in the name of improvement. One afternoon, I came home to find the living room completely transformed. My mother's favorite armchair gone without a word. She dictated every meal, methodically erasing the familiar flavors of my childhood. My father, seemingly lost in what he must have mistaken for her charm, was completely blind to it all. He didn't seem to notice me becoming an island, slowly being shoved to the absolute fringes of the new family unit he was so desperate to build. Her daughter Olivia, who was 2 years my senior, had a perpetually condescending smirk plastered on her face. Her brother Leo, a year younger than me, was a ball of pure aggression, always spoiling for a fight. From the moment they walked through the door, they treated me like an intruder in my own home. Olivia's cruelty was verbal. When the adults were out of earshot, she'd lean in and whisper the word orphan, drawing it out to make it sound like the ugliest thing in the world. Leo's torment was physical. He'd shove me hard in the hallways when no one was looking or steal my most treasured toys, his face breaking into a triumphant, ugly laugh at the sight of my helpless rage. And Diana, their mother, didn't just allow this. She seemed to relish it. She would watch their little cruelties with a quiet look of approval, her own verbal cuts just as sharp. Her words always carried the clear implication that my very presence was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. "Adrian, darling, why can't you try to be more like Olivia and Leo? They're such well-mannered children," she'd say, her voice dripping with a saccharine poison that made my stomach clench. The worst of it came one evening when I was passing my father's study. I paused outside the door, hearing her voice, low and persuasive. I heard her tell my father that I was the spare part in this new family. She said that looking at me only reminded him of Clara, and that for them to truly move on, that memory had to be scrubbed away. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The words hit me like physical blows, knocking the air from my lungs. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my father what was happening, about the taunts, the shoves, the constant feeling of being unwanted, he just sighed, a deep, tired sound. He brushed my concerns aside, telling me I was the one who needed to adapt to the new reality. "Diana is a good woman, Adrian, just give it some time," he said, his gaze distant and exhausted, never quite meeting mine. Even then, a small part of me couldn't bring myself to fully blame him. I could still see the grief clinging to him like a shroud, and I understood he was just trying to survive. He was desperate to piece his life back together, to patch the enormous hole Clara had left behind. But I couldn't escape the feeling that with every dismissive wave of his hand, a little more of his love for me was slipping away. The years that followed were a blur of quiet, persistent misery. At school, I retreated into myself, becoming the silent, solitary kid in the back of the classroom. My peers labeled me the weirdo because I'd spend recess by myself, meticulously folding paper into the shape of cranes or writing in the worn notebook my mother had left behind. At home, the torment was more direct. I did my best to stay invisible, to avoid Diana and her children, but it was a losing battle. They seemed to have a sixth sense for finding me, for finding new ways to inflict pain. I'll never forget the day, I was 12, when Leo found the special paper crane, the last one my mother and I had folded together. He held it up, a cruel smirk on his face, and deliberately ripped its wings off. Something inside me snapped. I flew at him, a howl of pure rage and grief tearing from my throat, tears blinding me. Diana materialized in the doorway in an instant. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't need to. She saw what she wanted to see. Her hand shot out and the slap echoed in the hallway, my cheeks stinging with a searing heat. "How dare you lay a hand on my son, you wretched little brat!" she shrieked, pulling a sniveling Leo into a protective embrace, positioning him as the innocent victim. When my father got home and heard her twisted version of events, he just let out that same weary sigh and told me to apologize to Leo. This time, I refused. I didn't say a word. I just turned and fled to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. I collapsed onto my bed and cried until my body ached and my throat was raw, until there were simply no tears left to shed. Each one of these wounds, big and small, accumulated over time, creating a web of invisible scars that defined my youth. It was then that a dream began to take root in my heart. The dream of escape. I started to fantasize about the day I could finally leave Bedford for good, to put Diana, Olivia, and Leo in my rearview mirror forever. I pictured a new life somewhere distant, a place where no one knew my history, where I could reinvent myself from scratch. But I was just a 12-year-old boy, powerless and broke, with nothing to my name but a collection of paper birds and the fading memory of my mother's love. Then one rainy night when I was 13 years old, while rummaging through some old things, my fingers brushed against a familiar leather cover. Tucked away in a dusty box under my bed, I found my mother's diary. Reading her familiar, elegant handwriting felt like finding a sliver of sunlight in the suffocating darkness of my life. She wrote about her love for me, her dreams for my future, her unshakable belief that I would grow into a man of strength and integrity. I found one passage that I must have read 1,000 times, my fingers tracing the words until the ink began to fade. "My Adrian, you are the most precious thing in my world. Never ever let anyone make you feel that you are not worthy of love and happiness." It was like a shield, a mantra I repeated to myself in the darkest moments. That diary became my secret sanctuary. In its blank pages, I poured out all the rage, the crushing loneliness, and the desperate, burning hope for a different life. I made a silent vow to my mother and to myself that I would not be broken. I would get out of this house, and I would not let Diana or anyone else dictate who I was. The rest of my middle school years were spent in a state of quiet perseverance. I buried myself in my studies, not for my father's approval or to impress Diana, but because I understood with absolute clarity that knowledge was my only ticket out. The school library became my second home. I devoured everything I could get my hands on, from the dense business textbooks in my father's study to the thrilling adventure novels my mother had loved. I was building the foundation for a future where I could be my own man, beholden to no one. Then, when I turned 16, my father's focus shifted. He started talking about my future, specifically my future at the head of Vance Holdings. He summoned me to his formal office, the one with the mahogany desk and the intimidating portraits of Vance ancestors staring down from the walls. He spoke of legacy, of duty, of the empire he had built. "Adrian, you are my heir," he said, his voice thick with a pride that felt utterly foreign to me. "This company, all of this will one day be yours." I stood there, surrounded by the symbols of his success, but I felt no flicker of pride. Instead, a cold dread began to creep through my veins. This wasn't my dream, it was his, and it felt like another cage being built around me. All I felt was the crushing weight of his expectations. A cynical part of me questioned his motives. Was this really about me? Or was it a clumsy, belated attempt to atone for years of emotional neglect? Diana predictably was furious about the entire arrangement. I caught her arguing with my father one night, her voice a venomous hiss. She insisted I was too immature, too unstable to ever run the company. It was Leo, she argued, who possessed the real qualities of a leader. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. Leo, a 15-year-old bully whose only talent was tormenting those weaker than him, was her idea of a future CEO. Her opinion shouldn't have mattered, but hearing her dismiss me so easily still felt like twisting a knife in an old wound. The following year, when I was 17, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was an acceptance letter from a university hundreds of miles away from Bedford. Holding it in my hands, I felt the first real flicker of hope I'd experienced in nearly a decade. This was it. This was my escape hatch, my chance to finally leave that house of pain behind and build something of my own. I started packing immediately, carefully placing my mother's diary and a small collection of paper cranes among my clothes, the only things I truly wanted to take with me. The night before my departure, I stood in my room and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The boy who stared back was not the same one who had cried himself to sleep over a ripped paper bird 5 years earlier. I was taller, my jaw was set, and my shoulders were broader. But beneath that hardened exterior, I could still feel the phantom ache of old wounds. The loss of my mother, the chilling indifference of my father, and the countless small cruelties inflicted by Diana and her children. Looking my reflection dead in the eye, I made another silent vow. The past would not be my prison. I would forge a new identity, build a life that would have made my mother proud. And so I walked away. I left Bedford behind, carrying a suitcase full of painful memories and a heart full of ferocious resolve. I climbed onto a bus in the pre-dawn hours just as a thick fog was rolling in, blanketing the familiar oak trees that lined the streets. In my worn backpack, I had a change of clothes, my mother's diary, and a handful of faded paper cranes. I didn't look back. I refused to give that house one last look, the place where I had spent a decade feeling like a trespasser. I was 18 years old with empty pockets and no family to call on. But I possessed one thing Diana and her children could never touch: a fierce, unyielding hope for something better. The Greyhound carried me east to Philadelphia, where I was set to start my life as a student at Drexel University. I'd picked the school not just because of the generous scholarship they offered, but because it felt like a world away from Bedford, far enough that I might finally be able to take a full, deep breath. When the bus finally hissed to a stop at the station, I stepped out into the chaos of a city I'd only ever seen in pictures. I stood there on the sidewalk, dwarfed by the towering buildings and swallowed by the river of anonymous faces rushing past me. A thrill of pure excitement shot through me, quickly followed by a tremor of raw fear. This was it, my blank slate, but it was also the first time in my life that I was completely terrifyingly on my own. My dorm room was a tiny stuffy box, barely big enough for the 2 sets of bunk beds and a single wobbly desk crammed against the wall. My new roommate, a guy named Ben, was already there. He was a lanky, cheerful kid from somewhere in the suburbs with a booming voice and an easy smile. "Yo, Adrian, where you from, man?" he asked as I wrestled my single duffel bag through the door. I froze for a second, the name of my hometown feeling like ash in my mouth. I didn't want to talk about Bedford. I didn't want to talk about my family. "Just a small town," I mumbled. "Nothing you'd have heard of." Thankfully, Ben just nodded and let it go. I was immensely grateful for his lack of curiosity. Those first few weeks of college were a chaotic blur. Everything was new and overwhelming: the sprawling campus, the packed lecture halls, the sheer volume of people. I felt like I was constantly treading water, trying to keep up. All the other students seemed so sure of themselves, so at ease in this new environment. They moved with a confidence that was completely alien to me. I declared my major as business administration. Part of me, I have to admit, did it because I knew it's what my father would have wanted. But a much bigger part of me did it for myself. I was determined to prove to him and to the world that I could build something significant entirely on my own terms, without his name or his money. But college wasn't the fairy tale escape I had envisioned. The scholarship was a lifeline, covering the massive cost of tuition. But the reality of day-to-day survival hit me hard and fast. Food, textbooks, laundry, toothpaste. The small necessities of life added up, and my meager savings evaporated almost overnight. I knew I needed a job. I found one bussing tables and washing dishes at a diner just off campus. The place always smelled of grease and stale coffee, and the constant clatter of plates and shouted orders became the soundtrack to my life. The work was grueling and it consumed nearly every hour I wasn't in class, but for the first time I felt a sense of real independence. The meager paycheck was mine, earned with my own two hands, and that feeling was more liberating than anything I'd ever known in Bedford. Working at the diner also forced me out of my shell. I had always been intensely private, building walls around myself as a defense mechanism against the kind of pain I'd endured as a child. But here I had no choice. I had to make small talk with customers, coordinate with the cooks, and listen to the endless chatter of my co-workers. It was terrifying, but it was also teaching me how to exist in the world. There was this one regular, an older woman named Mrs. Gable, who came in every Tuesday morning like clockwork. She'd sit in the same booth, order black coffee and a toasted English muffin, and read the newspaper for an hour. One day, as I was refilling her coffee, she looked up at me, her gaze surprisingly sharp. "You have sad eyes, young man," she said quietly, "but there's a fire in them too. Don't you let whatever put that sadness there snuff out the fire." I just managed a tight smile, but her words struck a chord deep inside me, stirring up all the hurt I was trying so desperately to keep buried. Most nights after my shift, I'd return to the empty dorm room and collapse at my wobbly desk. Under the dim light of a cheap lamp, I would carefully open my mother's diary. Her words were my anchor in the storm of my new life. I used its blank pages to document my new existence, scribbling down everything from the small victory of a good grade on an exam to the deep, aching loneliness I felt watching other students on the phone with their parents, sharing stories of their week. I never called Bedford. My father tried to reach me a few times, but the conversations were always stilted and brief, filled with long, uncomfortable silences. "Are you doing all right, Adrian?" he would ask, his voice sounding distant and tinny over the line. "Yeah, I'm fine," I'd lie, even on the days when I felt like I was drowning. I couldn't let him know how much I was struggling. I couldn't bear the thought of him seeing me as weak or incapable. Diana, of course, never reached out. I learned from my father in one of our clipped phone calls that she and her children were still firmly entrenched in his life. Leo was apparently getting ready to apply to college himself, and Olivia had become some sort of campus socialite. Hearing about their lives felt like listening to a story about strangers. It solidified the feeling that I had never truly been a part of that family to begin with. But a strange thing was happening. The news no longer stung with the same intensity. My focus was on my own path, my own future. That was all that mattered. Life in Philadelphia wasn't just a grind of work and study, though. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let people in. I started making friends, people who saw me only as Adrian, the guy from their economics class, not as the damaged kid from a broken home. Ben became my first real friend. He was relentless, constantly pulling me out of my self-imposed isolation. He'd drag me along to boisterous college basketball games or to crowded, sweaty parties in off-campus apartments. I'd usually end up lingering in a corner, nursing a lukewarm soda, just watching everyone else. "You gotta live a little, man," Ben would say, throwing a friendly arm around my shoulders. Loosen up. I'd force a smile, but I knew the walls I'd built around my heart weren't going to come down that easily. It was a part of me now, that caution, that instinct to keep a safe distance. Then, in a macroeconomics lecture, I met a girl named Lauren. She had a wild mane of curly brown hair and a laugh that could fill a room. She slid into the seat next to me, asked if she could borrow a pen, and just like that, a conversation started. Lauren was unlike anyone I had ever known. She was direct and witty, but she also had a deep well of empathy that caught me off guard. One afternoon, I made a passing casual remark about my mother, and her reaction was immediate. She reached out and gently touched my arm. "Losing someone you love like that is the worst thing in the world," she said softly, her eyes full of a genuine warmth. "But you're still standing. You're still fighting. That takes incredible strength." I was speechless. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt truly seen. Lauren and I started as study partners, and from there a deeper connection blossomed. We spent countless late nights in the quiet hum of the library, fueled by cheap coffee and vending machine snacks, sharing our hopes for the future. She dreamed of becoming an investigative journalist, of using her words to expose injustice and make a difference. I found myself opening up to her, telling her about my own ambitions, not just to build a real estate empire, but to create something meaningful. I talked about building affordable housing, designing public green spaces, creating places where people could feel a true sense of belonging, a real sense of home. Lauren would listen intently, her thoughtful gaze making me feel like those distant, lofty dreams might actually be within my reach. But the path wasn't always easy. There were days when the sheer exhaustion of juggling my classes, my job, and the unresolved grief that still churned inside me felt like too much to bear. One of those nights, while I was closing up the diner, my phone rang. It was my father. His voice was different. It was strained, unsteady. It wasn't the voice of the powerful, confident man I knew. "Adrian," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I need you to come home for Christmas. The family needs you here." A cold, familiar anger flared up inside me. Family? What family was he talking about? The one that had stood by and watched as Diana and her children made my life a living hell. The one that had made me feel like a ghost in my own home. I told him I couldn't, that I was busy studying for a major exam, and then I ended the call. But as I stood there in the silent, empty diner, my hands started to shake. A wave of guilt washed over me. Was I being too cruel? Was I becoming as cold as they had been to me? That year, I stayed in Philadelphia for Christmas. I picked up as many extra shifts at the diner as I could, both for the money and to keep the suffocating loneliness at bay. Ben invited me to his family's Christmas dinner. I went, and for one evening I was enveloped in the chaotic warmth of a loving family. People who treated me with an uncomplicated kindness that felt both wonderful and painful. But later that night, back in the quiet of my dorm room, I opened my mother's diary, and the tears I'd been holding back finally came. I missed her with an intensity that was a physical ache. I missed the Christmases of my childhood, back when the house in Bedford was still filled with her laughter and the smell of pine needles and baking. I wondered if I would ever feel that kind of simple, uncomplicated joy again. In my second year, I took a leap and joined the university's entrepreneurship club. It was a revelation. It was a place where ideas were currency, where I was surrounded by other young people buzzing with ambition and creativity. Drawing on the poverty I'd witnessed in the neighborhoods around campus, I developed and pitched a detailed proposal for an affordable, sustainable housing initiative. To my astonishment, my project was chosen as a finalist in a university-wide startup competition. For the first time, I felt a sense of validation that came from my own mind, my own work. The night before the final presentation, I was a wreck. I paced my tiny room, practicing my speech over and over in front of the cracked mirror on my closet door. I pictured my mother in the audience, her face beaming with pride, and it gave me the strength to push through my fear. The next day, I stood on that stage, and the presentation was a resounding success, far better than I could have ever hoped. My team took second place, and afterward, one of the judges, a professor in the urban planning department, approached me and offered me a position as his research assistant on a sustainable development project. It felt like a door swinging open to a future I had only dared to dream about. That moment was a profound turning point. A new belief began to take hold. I was more than just the unwanted boy from Bedford. I had value. I could build something real. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as I was starting to feel confident, a letter arrived from home. The handwriting on the envelope was not my father's. It was Diana's. The note inside was short and colder than a winter wind. It informed me, didn't ask, that my father expected me to return to Bedford after graduation and take up a position at Vance Holdings. "Robert seems to think you have some potential," she wrote, her condescending tone practically leaping off the page. I, for one, remain unconvinced. A hot white rage surged through me. I ripped the letter into tiny, furious pieces. Diana, the woman who had treated me like dirt for years, now presumed to have some say in my future. The audacity of it was breathtaking. In that moment, my resolve hardened into steel. I would never go back to Bedford. I would never work for Vance Holdings. I would build my own empire far from their toxic influence. My last 2 years of college flew by in a frantic blur of activity. I took on every odd job I could find, waiting tables, tutoring underclassmen, working retail during the holidays. I became obsessively frugal, saving every dollar I could scrape together. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about building a fortress of financial independence, a safety net that would ensure I never had to rely on anyone but myself ever again. Lauren remained a constant, steady presence in my life, my closest friend, my most trusted confidant. I was keenly aware that my feelings for her were deepening into something more, something I was terrified to name, but I kept my guard up. I wasn't ready to let her, or anyone, all the way in. The shadows of my past still loomed too large, and I was afraid they would swallow up anything good that came into my life. On graduation day, I sat among my classmates in the crowded auditorium, a sea of black robes and beaming faces. I watched as other families cheered and hugged their children. My father wasn't there. He sent a generic congratulations card with a sizable check enclosed. I set the card aside and never cashed the check. I wasn't angry, not really. I was just empty. It was simply another confirmation of the distance between us, a final, quiet severing of a bond that had frayed long ago. A profound sadness settled over me, a quiet acknowledgement that the chasm between my father and me had become too vast to ever cross. I walked away from Drexel University with a business degree in one hand and a head full of ambitious dreams. I saw my future unfolding in a vibrant new city, maybe Portland or Denver, a place where I could launch my real estate career from the ground up. I would build the things I'd talked about with Lauren: thoughtful, sustainable communities, affordable homes, places that fostered connection and belonging. But as my mother used to say, life has a funny way of making you confront the very things you're running from. Just a few weeks after I'd tossed my graduation cap in the air, a phone call from my father yanked me right back toward the one place on earth I had sworn I would never set foot in again: Bedford, Ohio. It was a dreary, rain-soaked afternoon. I was sitting on the floor of my tiny Philadelphia apartment, sifting through a handful of job offers from various tech startups when my phone buzzed. It was him. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of urgency I'd never heard before. "Adrian, I need you home. Vance Holdings needs you." I couldn't speak. My knuckles went white as I gripped the phone. Home? The word was a mockery. Home was the house where Diana had told my father I was a spare part, where Olivia and Leo had systematically chipped away at my spirit. But the desperation in his voice was undeniable. It left no room for argument. "This is your legacy, Adrian. You're my heir. I'm not getting any younger," he said, and for the first time I heard the bone-deep weariness in his voice. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to shout that I didn't want or need Vance Holdings, that I was going to build my own life on my own terms. But there was another part of me, a smaller, younger part that still desperately yearned for his validation, that hesitated. And in that moment of hesitation, I was lost. My mind flashed back to his office, to the imposing portraits of the Vance men, to his impassioned speeches about tradition and legacy. A dangerous thought took root. Maybe this was my chance. Maybe this was how I could finally, definitively prove to Diana and to myself that I was not the worthless burden she had always made me out to be. And so, betraying every self-protective instinct I had, I said yes. I packed my few belongings, said a difficult goodbye to Philadelphia, and promised Lauren I would stay in touch. Then I boarded a bus heading west, back to the place I had escaped. As we rolled past the familiar "Welcome to Bedford, Ohio" sign, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The old house looked the same, imposing and grand from the outside, but I could feel its coldness from the street. Diana was waiting at the door, her face arranged into that same practiced, insincere smile. "Adrian, darling, it's been ages," she cooed, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. I just nodded, unable to form a reply, and stepped over the threshold. I felt like a stranger who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a hostile, alien country. Vance Holdings was headquartered in a sleek 3-story glass building right in the center of town. My father met me in his office. He gave me a quick, clumsy hug, his hands patting my back awkwardly. "You've changed," he said, his eyes clouded with something that looked like regret. "You're a man now." 100 questions burned on my tongue. Why didn't you come to my graduation? Why did you let her run our lives? Why did you abandon me? But I swallowed them all. I told myself I wasn't here to dig up the past. I was here to work. He took me on a tour of the office, introducing me to the staff as the future of the company. I saw the sideways glances, the whispers, the open skepticism on more than a few faces. The most hostile look came from Leo, now 22, and sporting the same arrogant smirk I remembered from our childhood. He was working in project development, a cushy job I was certain Diana had secured for him. Olivia, now a polished and poised 25-year-old, was the head of public relations. The whole family was here. It was a viper's nest, and I had just walked right into the middle of it. Diana naturally held no official position, but her presence was a constant. She attended every important meeting, a silent, watchful queen on her throne, subtly manipulating every decision from the shadows. My father started me off as a junior project manager. A way to learn the business from the ground up, he called it. I knew immediately that it was Diana's doing. This was her strategy. Keep me buried in the corporate hierarchy, bogged down with insignificant tasks, while she and Leo consolidated their own power. They treated me like a glorified intern, not the owner's son. I was tasked with proofreading documents, filing reports, and even making coffee runs. It was a calculated campaign of humiliation. I clenched my jaw and took it all, vowing to myself that I would outwork and outsmart them. I immersed myself in the company's history, pulling old files, reading every project proposal and financial report I could get my hands on. I discovered that Vance Holdings had once been a company with a conscience. In its early days, my father had focused on building quality, affordable homes and community-focused developments. But somewhere along the way, under Diana's influence, the company's soul had been corrupted. The focus had shifted entirely to high-end, high-profit luxury condos and sprawling, soulless shopping malls. It felt like a betrayal of my father's original vision, and it was the antithesis of everything I wanted to build. I started speaking up in meetings, trying to steer the ship back in the right direction. I presented detailed plans for new affordable housing initiatives, for projects using sustainable green materials, for reinvesting in Bedford's neglected neighborhoods. A few of the older, long-term employees seemed receptive, but Diana and Leo shut me down at every turn. "Adrian, you're still new to this. You don't understand how the market really works," Leo would say, his tone dripping with condescension. Diana's approach was more subtle, but just as effective. She would offer a thin, dismissive smile and say, "Such a lovely sentiment, dear, but we're running a business, not a charity. We have to prioritize our profit margins." My father would just sit there, silent, looking tired. But it was my father's silence that cut the deepest. He would just sit at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, and say nothing. His passivity was more painful than Diana's most vicious remarks. I desperately wanted him to intervene, to have my back, to be the father I remembered from my early childhood. But that man was gone. I started to wonder if he had ever really wanted me here, or if this was all just a pathetic attempt to ease his own guilty conscience. The situation finally came to a head during a board meeting about a massive new development. It was Leo and Diana's pet project, a sprawling, exclusive luxury resort on the outskirts of town. The plan required the complete demolition of an entire working-class neighborhood, displacing hundreds of families. I couldn't let it happen. I had to say something. I stood up, my hands shaking but my voice steady, and I laid out an alternative vision. We could revitalize the existing neighborhood, I argued. We could renovate the homes, build new, truly affordable housing, and create a community hub that would generate local jobs. "This is about more than just a balance sheet," I said, my voice rising with passion. "This is about our moral obligation to the people of this town." A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. I looked directly at my father, pleading with my eyes for him to finally take a stand. He just shook his head slowly and let out a long, weary sigh. "Adrian, you're idealistic. That's admirable, but it's not how the world works. Leo's project has already been greenlit. It's too late to change course." His words were a physical blow. A triumphant, ugly smirk spread across Leo's face. Diana actually started to applaud softly, as if she'd just enjoyed a particularly satisfying piece of theater. The rage that had been simmering inside me for months finally boiled over. I didn't say another word. I just gathered my papers, turned my back on all of them, and walked out, letting the heavy oak door slam shut behind me. That night, back in the suffocating silence of my childhood bedroom, I stared at the flock of paper cranes my mother and I had made, now dusty and faded, hanging from the ceiling. I picked up the phone and called Lauren. She was the only person on earth I knew would understand. "I can't do this, Lauren," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't belong here. I tried. I really tried, but they don't want me." She just listened patiently until I was done, and then her voice came through the line, calm and clear. "Adrian, you have nothing to prove to them. You are enough just as you are. You don't need their approval to be worthy." Her words were a lifeline in a sea of despair. Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit, but they couldn't erase the deep, bitter sting of my father's betrayal. The thought of leaving Bedford began to take shape in my mind again, this time with a new urgency. I couldn't spend my life living under Diana's thumb, working for a company whose values were a direct violation of my own. And yet a stubborn part of me wanted to stay and fight. to wrestle Vance Holdings back from the brink, to restore the legacy my father had once been so proud of. I was caught in an impossible tug-of-war between my duty to him and my own desperate need for freedom. A few days later, I went into the office before sunrise, determined to speak with my father alone, to have one last honest conversation. I knocked on his office door, but there was no response. Gently, I pushed it open. The sight that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, clutching a framed photograph of my mother. My heart clenched. He looked up, and I was shocked by the raw grief I saw in his eyes. They were the eyes of a broken man. "Adrian," he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion. "I'm so sorry, I know. I know I failed you. I haven't been the father you deserved." For the first time in over a decade, the wall he had built around himself crumbled, and I saw the vulnerable, grieving man underneath. A part of me wanted to go to him, to put my arms around him and tell him it was okay. But I couldn't. The years of hurt had built a wall inside me too. All I could manage was a single stiff nod before I backed out of the room, my heart a confused mess of anger and a fragile, flickering hope. Maybe, just maybe, the father I remembered was still in there somewhere. That hope was extinguished at the very next project meeting. Leo, emboldened by his recent victory, openly mocked me in front of the entire team, calling my ideas for community development childish fantasies. Diana let out a theatrical, dismissive laugh. And my father said nothing. He just stared down at the table, his face a blank mask. That was the final straw. I couldn't take another second of it. I stood up, looked my father directly in the eye, and said, my voice shaking with rage, "If this is the company you want to run, then I have no place in it." I turned and walked out, not even flinching as I heard Diana's voice call after me, dripping with mock concern. That night, for the second time in my life, I packed my bags. This time I knew I was leaving Bedford for good. I had no destination in mind, only the certain knowledge that I could not stay. I wrote a short letter to my father, telling him that I wasn't leaving out of anger, but out of a need to forge my own identity. I left the note on his desk in the dead of night and drove out of Bedford as the first light of dawn was breaking. A strange mix of profound grief and exhilarating freedom churning in my gut. For days I just drove. I had no map, no plan. I just pointed my car west and kept going, sleeping in cheap anonymous motels along the highway as if sheer distance could outrun the ghosts of my past. After nearly a week of this aimless wandering, a name popped into my head. Portland. It felt right. It would be my new beginning. I chose Portland for one simple reason. It was on the opposite side of the continent, about as far as you could get from Ohio without leaving the country. I arrived with no job, no contacts, and no real plan beyond a business degree, a few $1,000s scraped together from my college jobs, and a stubborn, burning desire to build the kind of communities I'd always dreamed of. I'll never forget my first moments in downtown Portland. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath, the air a mix of salty brine from the river and the rich, earthy smell of coffee wafting from a nearby cafe. The city, with its gleaming glass towers and famously persistent drizzle, felt like a promise, a place where I could wash away the past and start again. Those initial weeks were a brutal reality check. I found a tiny, perpetually damp basement apartment in a neighborhood called St. John's, where the paint was peeling and the wail of distant train horns was a constant nightly soundtrack. My savings were disappearing at an alarming rate, and the pressure to find work became immense. After dozens of rejections, I finally landed a job as a junior assistant at a small, scrappy real estate firm called Riverbend Properties. They specialized in affordable housing projects. The pay was terrible, and the work was anything but glamorous. I spent my days making copies, running errands, and fetching coffee for the senior agents. But it was a start. It was a foot in the door of the world I wanted to be a part of. My days were filled with endless paperwork, a constantly ringing phone, and 100 menial tasks. But it was also an incredible learning opportunity. I was surrounded by people who were driven by a genuine passion for their work, who truly believed in the power of real estate to create positive change. The owner of the company was a man named David Sterling, a burly, no-nonsense guy in his late 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He took notice of my work ethic and, to my surprise, started asking for my opinion in meetings, even though I was the lowest person on the totem pole. One afternoon, I timidly suggested an idea for converting a derelict industrial lot into a public green space with community gardens. David didn't dismiss it. He just nodded thoughtfully and said, "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Adrian. Don't ever let anyone tell you your ideas don't have merit." His simple encouragement felt like a gift. It echoed my mother's words from her diary, and it filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. But making a new life in Portland was a grind. There were nights I'd lie awake on my lumpy mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and a wave of doubt would wash over me. Was I crazy? Had I made a huge mistake? I missed Lauren terribly. I missed our easy conversations, our shared dreams, the way she could make me laugh. We tried to keep in touch, but with the time difference and our demanding schedules, the calls became less and less frequent. "I'm so proud of everything you're doing, Adrian," she told me during one of our brief conversations. "But please, don't forget to live a little. Don't burn yourself out." I promised her I wouldn't, but it was an empty promise. I was running on pure adrenaline, fueled by a desperate need to prove to myself that I could succeed without my father's name or his money. I threw myself into my work that first year in Portland. I became a sponge, absorbing everything I could about market analysis, contract negotiation, and community outreach. Riverbend Properties was a fraction of the size of Vance Holdings, but here, for the first time in my professional life, I felt like my contributions actually mattered. I felt seen. I was finally given the chance to help manage a significant project: the construction of a new affordable housing complex for low-income seniors. I poured my heart and soul into it, spending countless hours researching innovative designs, sourcing sustainable building materials, and collaborating with city planners. The day the first residents started moving in, I stood across the street and just watched. Seeing the joy on their faces as they entered their new homes filled me with a sense of profound satisfaction I had never experienced working at Vance Holdings. This was real. This mattered. But the climb was steep and relentless. There were days I worked until I was delirious with exhaustion, sometimes waking up with my cheek stuck to a pile of blueprints on my desk. I faced constant rejection from potential investors who saw my commitment to sustainability and community as naive idealism. I'll never forget one meeting where a prominent developer literally laughed in my face. "You're a kid, Adrian," he said, shaking his head. "The market doesn't care about your pretty little dreams. It cares about the bottom line, period." I managed a tight, polite smile, but inside I was seething. I would not become like them. I would not let my ambition curdle into the kind of soulless greed that had consumed Diana and Leo. To supplement my meager salary, I started bartending on weekends at a noisy dive bar downtown. The hours were brutal and the clientele could be rough, but it taught me how to stay calm under pressure and how to read people, skills that proved invaluable in my day job. One late night, as I was polishing glasses at the end of my shift, I overheard a man at the bar drunkenly complaining about his own father, a workaholic who had emotionally abandoned his family. The story hit a little too close to home. It made me think of my own father and of the letter I'd left on his desk. Had he ever read it? Did he ever wonder what had become of me? I shoved the thoughts away as quickly as they came. I couldn't afford to look back. By my second year in Portland, I was starting to make a name for myself in the local real estate scene. People were beginning to notice the kid from Riverbend Properties who was doing things differently. Our senior housing project won a local design award and got some positive press. A small feature in the city's weekly paper ran with the headline, "The New Face of Portland Real Estate." David called me into his office, a rare smile on his face. He slapped me on the back and said, "Good work, Adrian. But don't get comfortable. This is just the beginning." He then offered me the opportunity of a lifetime. The chance to head up a brand new, ambitious mixed-use development. A project that would combine residential units, retail space, and a public park. I knew it would be the most demanding thing I had ever attempted, and I accepted without a moment's hesitation. It took nearly 3 years of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, but we did it. On the day of the grand opening, I stood in the middle of the new park we had created, watching kids splash in the fountain and families picnicking on the grass. A wave of emotion washed over me and my eyes filled with tears. I thought of my mother, of her gentle smile and the paper cranes we had folded together. I thought of her words in the diary telling me to always believe in my own value. I had finally built something that she would have been proud of. And I had done it all on my own. But the past is a stubborn ghost, and it always finds a way to circle back. One morning I was in my office prepping for a meeting with a new investor when my cell phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice on the other end, soft and hesitant, introduced herself as a private nurse. She told me she had been caring for my father during his final illness. "Mr. Vance passed away last night, Adrian," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm so sorry, but there are some things I need to tell you, things you have a right to know. Can we meet?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My father, dead. My mind went blank. Why had no one called me? And what secrets could this stranger possibly know? I canceled all my appointments, went straight home, and booked the next flight back to Ohio. I had no idea what was waiting for me, but I knew with a sinking certainty that the past I had tried so desperately to outrun was finally catching up. As I stared out my office window at the familiar Portland rain, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter what I was about to walk into, I would not let them break me. I would not let them touch the life I had built. A soft, steady rain was falling on the streets of Bedford when I arrived, 5 years after I had fled in the middle of the night. I didn't go to the house on the hill. I drove directly to the Bedford Memorial Chapel on Elm Street, a modest, white-steepled building I hadn't set foot in since my mother's funeral. The moment I walked through the doors, the cloying, sweet smell of lilies assaulted my senses, a scent forever linked in my mind with death. The room was filled with hushed whispers. I recognized some of the faces, longtime employees from Vance Holdings, a few of our old neighbors, but no one would meet my gaze. They looked at me, then quickly looked away as if I were an apparition they weren't supposed to see. And then I saw them. Diana, Olivia, and Leo clustered together near my father's closed casket like a flock of vultures. Diana, now well into her 50s, was as impeccably coiffed and elegantly dressed as ever. Olivia, her face a mask of carefully applied makeup, was whispering to some man I didn't know. Leo, who had grown into a broad, imposing man, stood with his arms folded across his chest, his eyes locking onto mine with a familiar, hostile glare. They didn't see me approach until I was standing right in front of them. The low hum of conversation in the room seemed to die away. The air grew thick and cold. It was Diana who broke the silence, her voice that same sickeningly sweet poison I remembered so well. "Adrian," she said, her lips curling into a semblance of a smile. "What on earth are you doing here?" Her tone, the way she spoke my name as if I were a complete stranger, sent a jolt of hot anger through my veins. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "I'm here for my father's funeral," I said, my voice low and even. "I have every right to be here, Diana." A cruel, knowing smirk played on her lips. She took a step toward me, the sharp click of her heels on the polished floor echoing in the sudden silence. "A right? You gave up any rights you had when you abandoned Robert, when you abandoned this family?" She hissed, her eyes darting toward Olivia and Leo for reinforcement. Olivia gave a slight, theatrical nod of agreement. Leo took a menacing step forward, his eyes raking over me with open contempt. "Let's be honest, you're only here for the money," Leo sneered, his voice a low growl. "Don't insult our intelligence by pretending you're here to mourn. Dad didn't want you here, we don't want you here." My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. I could feel the rage building in my chest, a primal urge to scream at them, to tell them I didn't give a damn about the inheritance, that all I wanted was a chance to say a proper goodbye. But I knew it was useless. They had already cast me as the villain in their story, the prodigal son returning only for a handout. My gaze shifted past them to the dark, gleaming wood of the casket adorned with a spray of white roses. My father was in there. The finality of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't ready for this. "I'm not here to fight," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I tried to move past Leo to get closer to the casket, but Diana stepped in front of me, her body a rigid barrier. She placed a manicured hand flat against my chest, her eyes glinting with a cold, triumphant fire. "You will not go near him," she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "You are not welcome here." "Robert was my husband," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "The father of my children. You forfeited your place in this family a long time ago." Each word was a fresh stab to my heart. I looked from her cold, triumphant face to the smug expressions of Olivia and Leo flanking her. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me. I wanted to shove her out of my way, to roar that I was his son, his only son, and that she had no right to stand between us. But then I became aware of the other people in the room, their eyes on us, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and pity. I knew with a sickening certainty that if I made a scene, it would only feed their narrative. I would be the unhinged, greedy outcast they already believed me to be. I met her gaze, my own voice now dangerously quiet, a blade of ice. "You don't get to define my father's family, Diana. I'm staying for the service. If you have a problem with that, you can call security, but I promise you I know my rights." Her composure faltered for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected me to push back. Leo started to move toward me again, but Diana held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. A slow, venomous smile spread across her face. "Fine, Adrian, stay. But don't for a second think you're getting a penny of Robert's money. He left everything to us." I didn't even bother to respond. The inheritance, Vance Holdings, it all meant nothing to me in that moment. I just needed to be near him. I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers, and approached the casket. Seeing him lying there, his face so thin and pale, stole the breath from my lungs. He looked like a stranger, a wax figure of the powerful man I remembered. My throat closed up and a hot pressure built behind my eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I rested them on the cool, polished wood. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." The rest of the service was a surreal, hazy blur. I stood in the back, a solitary figure, listening to the eulogies that painted a picture of a man I barely recognized. They spoke of Robert Vance, the brilliant businessman, the loving husband, the devoted stepfather. They didn't speak of my father, they didn't speak of Clara. It was as if we had been completely erased from his history. Despite their open hostility, I asserted myself. I took over the final arrangements. I chose the music. Amazing Grace, a hymn he had always loved, the same one my mother used to hum to me as a child. I insisted on delivering a eulogy. I spoke not of the years of pain and distance, but of the father I remembered from before, the man who would swing me up into his arms and tell me stories about the stars. I wanted, just for a moment, for people to remember that man, not the one Diana had created. She did everything she could to undermine me. I saw her whispering to Olivia and Leo throughout the service, her gestures clearly indicating me, the unwanted guest. When it was my turn to speak, Leo let out a loud, exaggerated cough, a pathetic attempt to rattle me. A few heads turned, but I ignored him. I kept my eyes fixed on the casket and spoke from the heart, my voice shaking but clear. When I finished, I saw tears in the eyes of some of the older employees, the ones who had been with my father from the beginning. They knew. They remembered. After the service, as the mourners began to file out, Diana cornered me near the entrance. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she hissed, her face a mask of pure hatred. "You can put on this little show, but it won't do you any good. Robert's will is ironclad. You're not getting a thing." I was too drained to even feel angry anymore. I just looked at her, my body heavy with exhaustion. "I don't care about the will, Diana," I said, my voice flat. "I told you I'm here for my father, not for his money." She just stared at me, her eyes narrowed, unable to comprehend a motive that wasn't driven by greed. It was then that a woman I didn't recognize approached us. She was the nurse who had called me. She scoffed, a short, ugly sound of disbelief, then swept away, her children trailing in her wake like obedient courtiers. That night I checked into a generic chain hotel on the highway, miles from the center of town. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that house, to sleep in that room where so many ghosts still lingered. I lay in the dark, staring at the textured ceiling. The image of my father's face in the casket burned into my mind. Did he know? Did he have any idea how much I had missed him, how much I had loved him, even through all the years of silence and pain? The next morning, as I was checking out, a woman approached me in the lobby. She was wearing a simple blue raincoat, and her face was etched with concern. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm the nurse who called you. My name is Susan." My heart started to hammer against my ribs. "What is this about?" I asked, trying to keep my own voice steady. "What did you want to tell me?" She cast a nervous glance over her shoulder as if she were being watched. She pressed a thick manila envelope into my hand. "This is from your father," she whispered. "He made me promise to give it to you personally, but please be careful. There are people who will do anything to keep you from knowing what's in here." I clutched the envelope, its unexpected weight feeling heavy and significant. My first instinct was to tear it open right there in the lobby, but the genuine fear in the nurse's eyes gave me pause. "Read it when you're somewhere private," she urged, before turning and quickly disappearing into the morning rush on the street outside. I went back up to my room, bolted the door, and sank onto the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal on the envelope. Inside, I found a sheaf of legal documents and a letter, handwritten on my father's personal stationery. I began to read, and with the very first sentence, the world fell out from under me. "Adrian, my son, if you are reading this, it means I have failed you in my final duty. I am so sorry for the years of pain I allowed you to endure. This letter is my last chance to tell you the truth." My father's shaky, uneven script was a testament to his failing health, and every word was a fresh wound. The letter was long, a confession filled with years of regret and secrets he had been forced to keep. He wrote of the crushing, suffocating grief that had consumed him after my mother's death, a darkness so profound that he had been blind to Diana's true nature. He had seen her as a lifeline, a way to rebuild our shattered family. He had been wrong. Diana was not the woman I believed her to be, he wrote. She was a master manipulator, Adrian, and I was too lost in my own pain, too weak to recognize it until it was too late. He went on to explain that Diana had systematically isolated him, taking control of his finances, his schedule, even his communications. She had intercepted his letters, screened his phone calls, and deliberately kept him from knowing where I was or what was happening in my life. She had told him that I despised him, that I had disowned him and wanted nothing more to do with him. I had to stop reading, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. I thought back to those stilted, painful phone calls during my first year of college, to the weariness in his voice when he'd asked if I was okay. I had mistaken his helplessness for indifference. All this time I had thought he didn't care. The truth was so much more cruel. Diana had methodically, deliberately poisoned him against me, twisting him into believing that I was the one who had abandoned him. The letter continued, each new revelation more horrifying than the last. He wrote that Diana and Leo had coerced him into signing a new will, one that disinherited me completely and transferred all his assets, including his controlling shares in Vance Holdings, directly to them. They made me believe I had no other choice, he wrote. They convinced me that you wanted nothing from me, that I had been a complete failure as a father. I allowed them to take everything, Adrian, but in these last few months I have been working to set things right. By the time you read this, I will be gone, but I have prepared a new will, one that reflects my true wishes. All of my assets, the house, the cars, the boat, the stables, and my controlling interest in Vance Holdings, I leave to you. You are the only one I trust to protect our family's legacy. I pray that someday you will find it in your heart to forgive me. The letter was not the only thing in the envelope. My father had also included a small USB drive containing copies of emails, text messages, and audio files he had secretly recorded. One file was a phone conversation between Diana and a man named Marcus Thorne, the CEO of our biggest competitor. I pressed play and my blood ran cold. I listened as Diana calmly negotiated the sale of key company assets to Thorne's firm for a fraction of their market value, in exchange for a secret multi-million-dollar kickback to be deposited in an offshore account. Robert will never find out, I heard her say, her voice devoid of any emotion. He's on his way out, and that pathetic son of his is a ghost. There's no one left to stop us. The raw, unvarnished truth of her treachery left me shaking with a rage so intense it made me feel sick. My father had seen her for what she was. He had tried to fight back, to reclaim what was his, but his illness had caught up to him before he could finish the fight. All the years I had spent hating him, all the times I had ignored his calls and hardened my heart against him, it all came crashing down on me. The weight of my own misplaced anger was a crushing burden, but I knew this was not the time for regret. This was the time for action. This was the time for justice. My father had given me the weapons I needed to fight back, and I would not let him down. I had to honor my father's last wish. I had to protect his life's work. I had to expose Diana for the monster she was. The following day, I called my father's personal attorney, a man named George Peterson. Mr. Peterson had been with Vance Holdings since before I was born, a trusted friend and advisor to my father for decades. I met him at his quiet, book-lined office downtown. He was a small, neat man with thinning white hair and intelligent, compassionate eyes. When I showed him the contents of the envelope, his expression shifted from sorrow to grim determination. "Adrian," he said, his voice low and serious, "this changes everything. If this new will is authentic, and I have no reason to doubt that it is, then the one Diana has filed is fraudulent. And this audio recording, and when this is evidence of conspiracy and corporate espionage, this is a criminal matter." Mr. Peterson laid out the legal path forward. We would challenge the fraudulent will in probate court and submit my father's true will for validation. The recording of Diana's conversation with Marcus Thorne would be our trump card, incontrovertible proof of her bad faith. I listened, nodding, my resolve hardening with every word he spoke. This would be a brutal, ugly fight, but I was ready. I was not the scared, helpless boy Diana had tormented all those years ago. I had built a life for myself in Portland. I had faced down my own demons and overcome my own challenges. I would not let her win. Diana, realizing that she was cornered, launched a preemptive strike. She began a vicious smear campaign, spreading rumors throughout Bedford that I had come back to town like a vulture, a greedy, opportunistic son trying to steal the family fortune. Some of our old neighbors, people who had known me my whole life, started to look at me with suspicion and distrust. But I didn't care what they thought. I knew the truth, and soon everyone else would too. I had the truth on my side, and I had the proof to back it up. I called David, my boss at Riverbend, and asked for an open-ended leave of absence. "I have to stay in Bedford for a while, David," I explained, my voice tight with emotion. "There are some family matters I need to take care of." He didn't press for details. "Take all the time you need, Adrian," he said, his voice full of a gruff kindness that I was immensely grateful for. "We'll hold down the fort here." With my legal strategy in motion, I began my own quiet investigation. I checked out of the hotel and rented a nondescript sedan, wanting to keep a low profile. Every morning before the sun came up, I would park down the street from the old house and just watch. Diana, Olivia, and Leo were still living there, their lives seemingly unchanged by my father's death. I watched them come and go, laughing and talking as if it were just another ordinary week. The sight of them living in my father's house, enjoying the fruits of his labor while they actively plotted to destroy his legacy, filled me with a cold, righteous anger. About a week after the funeral, my patience paid off. One afternoon, I saw the three of them leave the house together, dressed in expensive business attire, and get into Diana's black sedan. My instincts screamed that this was something important. I started my car and followed them, keeping a safe distance. They drove downtown and pulled into the parking garage of a large, corporate-looking office building. A polished brass plaque by the entrance read, "Crawford and Associates, Attorneys at Law." This was it. This had to be their lawyer's office. I parked across the street and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew with absolute certainty that they were in there finalizing their plans to probate the fraudulent will. Diana marched into the building like she owned it, Olivia and Leo scurrying in her wake. The second they were out of sight, I was on the phone with Mr. Peterson. I told him where they were. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I know that firm, Adrian," he said finally, his voice grim. "They're sharks. They specialize in high-stakes estate litigation. If Diana is meeting with them, she's making her move to legitimize the fraudulent will. Do you have your father's letter and the real will with you?" "Yes," I said, my hand instinctively going to the inner pocket of my jacket where I had kept the envelope since the nurse had given it to me. "I haven't let it out of my sight." "Good," Mr. Peterson said. "Stay put, I'm on my way. We're going to end this right now." The 15 minutes I spent waiting for him felt like an eternity. My mind raced. I thought of my father, of his final, desperate attempt to make things right. I thought of all the years of pain and misunderstanding that had been orchestrated by the woman sitting in that office building just a few hundred feet away. I would not fail him. I would not let her win. Mr. Peterson arrived, looking every bit the seasoned legal warrior, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit and carrying a worn leather briefcase. A surge of confidence washed over me. "Let's go, Adrian," he said, his eyes glinting with determination. "It's time to put an end to this charade." We walked into the law offices of Crawford and Associates. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. The receptionist, a young woman with a bored expression, looked up as we approached. "We're here to see Mr. Crawford," Mr. Peterson announced, his voice ringing with an authority that could not be denied. "It's about the estate of Robert Vance." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly. After a brief, flustered phone call, she showed us down a long hallway and into a large, glass-walled conference room. Diana, Olivia, and Leo were seated at a long, polished mahogany table, across from a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who I assumed was Mr. Crawford. They all looked up as we entered, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. The moment Diana saw me, she leaped to her feet, her face turning a sickly shade of pale. "Adrian, what is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. "Please, have a seat, Mrs. Vance," Mr. Peterson said, his voice calm and steady but with an undercurrent of steel. He walked to the head of the table and placed his briefcase down with a soft thud. He turned to Mr. Crawford and handed him the documents from my father. "My name is George Peterson. I am the attorney representing Adrian Vance, the sole and rightful heir to the estate of Robert Vance. We have reason to believe that the will my client's stepmother has filed for probate is a fraudulent document." A stunned silence descended on the room. Mr. Crawford took the papers, his carefully neutral expression slowly dissolving into one of deep concern as he began to read. Diana started to sputter, her voice a high-pitched whine. "That's a lie, he's a liar, he's trying to steal from us." I took a step forward, my eyes locking with hers. "You're the liar, Diana," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of years of pain. "You lied to my father. You isolated him, you turned him against me, you coerced him into signing that fake will. And you were planning to sell off his company to Marcus Thorne. I know everything. I have the recordings, I have the emails. It's over." Leo, who had been sitting silently beside her, his face a mask of rage, suddenly exploded. He shot to his feet, sending his chair crashing backward onto the floor. "You son of a bitch," he roared. "I'll kill you." Before he could take another step, Mr. Crawford looked up from the documents, his face grim. He fixed Diana and Leo with an icy stare. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Vance, I strongly advise you to remain silent. If these allegations are true, you are both facing consequences of the most serious nature, both civil and potentially criminal." Diana crumpled back into her chair as if her bones had turned to jelly, her face the color of ash. Leo opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Olivia, who had been silent until now, let out a soft, choked sob. I looked at the three of them, their empire of lies collapsing around them, and I felt no sense of victory. Only a profound, bottomless sadness for all the wasted years, for all the pain they had caused, for the father I had lost twice, once to them and now, forever. They had been given everything, my father's love, his home, his wealth, his protection, and it hadn't been enough. Their insatiable greed had driven them to destroy him. I took a deep, steadying breath. "Mr. Crawford," I said, my voice clear and even, "I have no desire for a protracted legal battle. I only want what is right. I want justice for my father." I looked at Diana, at her children. "I want them out of my father's house, and I want them gone from Bedford for good. If they agree to leave peacefully and relinquish any and all claims to the estate, I will not press criminal charges." Diana's head snapped up, her eyes burning with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you're so magnanimous," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. Mr. Peterson cut her off. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "I would strongly advise you to accept my client's very generous offer. If this matter proceeds to court, I can assure you you will lose a great deal more than just the house." The silence in the room was thick with tension. Finally, after a long, agonizing moment, Diana gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Olivia and Leo remained silent, their heads bowed in defeat. Without another word, the three of them rose and walked out of the conference room, their shoulders slumped, their reign of terror finally at an end. Mr. Crawford assured me that his office would cooperate fully in validating the authentic will and ensuring a smooth transfer of the estate. As the door clicked shut behind them, I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders, only to be replaced by a hollow, aching void. I had won. I had gotten justice for my father, but the price had been devastatingly high. The family I had once so desperately wanted was now shattered beyond any hope of repair. I remained in Bedford for another week, working with Mr. Peterson to finalize the legal transfer of my father's estate. As I had demanded, Diana and her children vacated the house the day after our confrontation at the lawyer's office. Olivia and Leo submitted their resignations from Vance Holdings and were gone from Bedford by the end of the week. The house on the hill was mine. The company was mine. It was all mine. And I had never felt more alone. I heard through the grapevine that they had moved to Florida, where Diana apparently had some distant relatives. I didn't care where they went, as long as they never came back. The house, the company, the wealth, it was all mine now. But I didn't want to live in that house. It was a museum of pain, haunted by too many ghosts. I decided to donate it to the city to be repurposed as a community arts center, a place for children to learn and create and dream, just as my mother had always encouraged me to do. I hired a local architect to oversee the renovation, with instructions to preserve the home's historic character while creating bright, modern studio spaces, a small library, and a performance hall. In the garden, where my mother's roses had once grown, I commissioned a small, elegant sculpture of a paper crane. Vance Holdings was a much bigger, more complicated problem. Under Diana's corrupting influence, the company had lost its way. The shady deals with Marcus Thorne were just the tip of the iceberg. The company's finances were a mess, its reputation was in tatters, and its corporate culture was toxic. I knew that rebuilding it would be a monumental task, but I was determined to try. I owed it to my father, and I owed it to myself. I flew back to Portland to tie up my loose ends at Riverbend Properties. I knew I would have to split my time between the two cities for the foreseeable future, a daunting prospect. But David, my mentor and friend, was unwavering in his support. "This is your chance to build something truly meaningful, Adrian," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Go make that company into something your father would be proud of." His words gave me the strength I needed. I felt the immense weight of the challenge ahead, but for the first time I also felt a surge of excitement, a sense of profound purpose. This was my legacy now, and I would not fail. The next year was a whirlwind. I shuttled back and forth between Portland and Bedford, working to rebuild Vance Holdings from the ground up. I surrounded myself with the company's most experienced, most loyal employees, the ones who remembered my father from the early days before Diana. They told me stories about his passion, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to the community. Their memories became my blueprint. I drafted a new mission statement, a new vision for the company, one that put people before profits, that focused on sustainable, community-oriented development. One of our first major undertakings was the revitalization of the very same neighborhood that Leo and Diana had planned to bulldoze for their luxury resort. Using company funds, we partnered with local nonprofits to build new, high-quality, affordable housing, a beautiful public park, and a job training center for local residents. The day the first families moved in, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. I was honoring my father's true legacy and my mother's spirit in a way that felt real and tangible. As Vance Holdings slowly but surely began to heal and to thrive under its new direction, I realized that I was finally integrating the two halves of my life. The company was no longer just a business to me, it was a tool, a way to make a positive impact on the world, a way to live out the values of compassion and responsibility that my mother had instilled in me so long ago. In my new office in Bedford, I hung my father's portrait on the wall. And right beside it, I hung a single perfect paper crane, a constant reminder of the long, painful journey that had brought me home. My story isn't about revenge or about winning some great inheritance. It's not about defeating Diana or reclaiming my birthright. It's about the lessons I learned in the crucible of my grief. It's about forgiveness. I learned that a real legacy isn't about money or buildings or power. It's about truth. It's about integrity. It's about our responsibility to one another. I learned to forgive my father. Not because he had earned it, but because I finally understood that I had to let go of my anger in order to truly be free. I learned that my worth was not defined by the cruelty of people like Diana, but by my own actions, my own choices. And I learned to hold on to the values my parents had given me: resilience in the face of hardship, kindness in a world that is often cruel, and an unwavering belief in our ability to build a better future. Bedford is no longer a prison of painful memories. It's the place where I finally found my way back to myself. It's the place where I am building a new legacy, one that honors both of my parents, and one that I hope will endure for generations to come.